Hi there and welcome to the video. I'm John Ivison and this week I am joined by my National Post colleague, writer and iconoclast Terry Glavin, and Sarah Teich, who is an attorney, an author, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and at one time held a research position at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism in Israel, which is extremely pertinent because we are going to be talking about the events in Israel and Gaza. So welcome to both. I'd like to start with the bombing of the Ahli Arab Hospital. In the House of Commons this week, the NDP's Heather McPherson was saying Canada should call for a ceasefire. But is that so at odds with what's happening on the ground that it is just unrealistic? Terry, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, the NDP is just being the NDP. I think they're trying to be the NDP without being too noticeable. It has a certain kind of pacifist tradition. It's an absolutely preposterous suggestion that now, after everything that's happened, now Israel has to hold fire. We don't know, by the way, what happened at that hospital. The overwhelming evidence seems to suggest that it was not the Israeli Air Force. But we don't know. And I think it's very telling that from the Prime Minister to the Foreign Minister to the New Democrats, all seem to just presume, right away, they jumped into this, they just presumed that hundreds of people had been killed in a hospital and had been killed by the Israelis. I think that's very, very telling.
Yeah, Sarah, let's pick up on that. I mean, when Heather McPherson asked that question, Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, stood up and said the government supports the state of Israel's right to defend itself within the bounds of international law. And I thought to that point the Liberals had been pretty sound in their response. But then Justin Trudeau came out without obviously having the facts at his fingertips, rushed response to the hospital bombing, clearly inferred that Israel was at fault. Melanie Joly, the Foreign Minister, had a tweet to a similar effect up for 2 or 3 days before any kind of context was put in. Do you think this is, Sarah, do you think this is domestic politics at play as usual, where our foreign policy is subsumed beneath the desperate scramble for votes?
Perhaps. Someone said that to me just yesterday, that Canada doesn't have that strong of a foreign policy sort of on its principles and instead panders to various voting communities. I've never worked in politics. I can't really say if that's true, but certainly the call for a ceasefire right now is completely unrealistic. And I also think it's holding Israel to a double standard that wouldn't hold anyone else to. In the sense that if this happened in the United States, like the October 7th massacre, if it happened in Canada, and there were still almost 200 hostages being held in another territory or another country, no way would we be calling on that country to stop fighting to get its hostages back. We'd be calling on that other, state or non-state actor. This analogy sort of falling apart, but we'd be calling on the holder of the hostages to release the hostages. So I think calling for a ceasefire is also the wholly wrong approach. Canada should be calling on Hamas to release the hostages, and that should be seen as the cause of the continuing violence, is the fact that they're still holding on to almost 200 hostages.
Can I just jump in for a sec, John?
Sure, Terry,
this isn't the first time. This is nothing. I recall Passover in 2022, which fell curiously at almost the same time as Ramadan and Easter and everything. The Hamas at that time had circulated a recurring conspiracy theory that the Israelis or the Jews were about to take over Al-Aqsa, or were tunneling under Al-Aqsa, or were storming Al-Aqsa. That's an interesting choice of language, by the way. The current campaign, which involved that unspeakable pogrom in southern Israel, was Al-Aqsa flood or Al-Aqsa storm. And so in 2022, Melanie Joly, Omar Al-Gabra, Iqra Khalid, about a dozen Liberal cabinet ministers and MPs all megaphoned that same conspiracy theory that, the Israelis have stormed Al-Aqsa, the IDF has desecrated the Holy Mosque. I mean, this is really, really incendiary, and it's extremely dangerous.
Right. I mean, we saw that Biden was meant to meet. Joe Biden was in Israel this week. He was meant to go to Jordan. He was meant to meet with the leaders of Egypt and the Palestinian Authority. And those meetings were cancelled as a result of what turns out it seems to be inaccurate information on the bombing of the hotel.
Yeah.
Sarah, can I come to you on the recurring theme of within the bounds of international law, which the government keeps stressing? I mean, it seems that the law of armed conflict gives Israel quite a lot of latitude to attack Hamas. It says that force has to be necessary and proportionate doesn't necessarily mean an equal number of casualties. Do you think Israel's behaviour thus far has been within the bounds of international law?
I think so. I mean, it's hard to say for certain, sort of in the heat of everything while we're still in this war. I think we'll have to really analyze this after the fact to get a concrete answer. But from what I've heard, I don't see anything that raises any serious red flags, except for the maybe 1 hour we thought that Israel bombed the hospital. An interesting thing happens with laws of armed conflict is, especially when it comes to Israel, this language is really weaponized without people really going through the analysis. And you see if you look at the casualty numbers on both sides, unfortunately, you do see many more Palestinian casualties. But in large part, that's because Hamas tells them not to leave. And we saw that in this conflict. We see that in others, that they use their own civilians as human shields. So that doesn't necessarily mean that Israel's breached any laws of war. And there's no law of war that says that you can't end up causing the death of large numbers of civilians. I mean, war is unfortunately, tragically bloody, and civilians do die. And when you talk about disproportionate, it also doesn't, there's a common misconception that people think that means that refers to the numbers of casualties and that they have to be more or less equal. It's actually about just like proportionality to the military aims, right? And Israel's aim is to eradicate Hamas.
Right. Terry, just taking a slightly broader look, I mean, Biden was as I mentioned, in Israel this week. How do you think he's done as far as walking the line? I mean, he's obviously trying to be supportive of Israel. He's trying to, I suspect, restrain Israel to some extent. Also trying to stop other players getting involved in this conflict. How's he done so far?
I think probably all right. I mean, I think the presumption is that that Biden's visit, just by the fact that he decided to go to Jerusalem, may have forestalled the incursion. You got to remember that 300,000 reservists have been called up, joined the regular IDF, heavily mechanized divisions are preparing to head into Gaza. He may have forestalled that.
Yes, they're not going to invade when he's there, right? Yeah.
But I think too that I have, having looked at this for years, and I think a terrible mistake, and I think Bibi Netanyahu is guilty of this as well, has been this proposition that for the purposes of stability, Joe Biden's all about stability, doesn't need any more headaches. The Russians have invaded Ukraine. The People's Republic of China has essentially declared war on the West. Tehran is causing mischief everywhere. Tehran is behind the Hamas. He doesn't want any apple carts upset. And at some point, I think we're going to have to resign ourselves to apple carts being upset. And that, I think, is almost the entire story of the last 20 years in the so-called Israeli-Palestine conflict. Hamas cannot be allowed to persist, period. It can't. And I think,
right.
The horror that will probably arise from, no matter how surgical Israel attempts to be, it's going to be horrible. It's going to be horrible.
I was in Israel, and I went to the West Bank. I went to Hebron some years ago now, but nothing much has changed. The conflict's pretty much frozen. It seemed to me that the some settlements in the West Bank are essentially suburbs of Jerusalem. The Ma'al Admin suburb, 7 kilometers east of Jerusalem, is essentially Mississauga. It's just a modern suburb, and the people move there not to follow in the steps of Abraham, but because it's essentially cheaper. But whereas others dividing Hebron into 2 bits, and one of them basically being an enclave of 800 settlers, there does seem to be room for Israel to make strategic decisions and make concessions, and there does seem to be a willingness, I think, to come to a deal if the Palestinian side, in particular Hamas, was ever to accept that the Jewish state exists as non-negotiable.
No, it's not going to happen.
But it's not going to happen.
It's not going to
So
happen.
where do we go? Sarah,
I think that's I'd be interested in what Sarah has to say about this, but I think part of the difficulty that we have here is that there is this misconception that all of the outrages, the barbarism that is so obviously attributable to Hamas is somehow just some kind of expression of Palestinian frustration, and that Hamas is, while it may go too far, it is some sort of expression of the Palestinian will to a self-governing sovereign state of its own. This is nonsense. Hamas is all about driving the Jews into the sea. That's all Hamas has ever been about. And until people recognize that, I think we're never going to be able to talk intelligently about this.
What do you think, Sarah? I mean, is that equally true of the Palestinian Authority?
No, Hamas is different from the Palestinian Authority. I mean, let's talk about Hamas for a second, because we should talk about the PA as well. But sort of building off what Terry said, it's actually even more than that. It's not just let's push the Jews into the sea. It's let's kill every Jew in the world. Yeah. And we saw that on, Wednesday the 11th of this year, when a former Hamas leader called for a global day of jihad, right? He called for every single supporter in the world to kill Jews, not Israelis, not Jews in Israel, Jews. I am a Jew in the world. I fled to my parents' house because my dad has legally registered weapons. My brother walked around the city with a switchblade to protect his girlfriend when they went to her nail appointment. My old high school was attacked. This is a very real phenomenon everywhere in the world. So Hamas is really sort of 100% agree. They don't have the Palestinian cause at heart. If Israel didn't exist, they would still have this aim of killing all the Jews. They are really just a ideologically extreme, genocidal terrorist organization. So I don't know how you make peace with a genocidal, ideologically extreme terrorist organization.
Well, let's talk about the Palestinian Authority, though, because presumably they would have to give up the right of return before any meaningful negotiation is possible. And Abbas does not seem to be able to do that in all the time he's been in power.
Right. Well, Abbas, the PA is certainly better than Hamas, but it's all relative, right? Abbas has a PhD in Holocaust denial. He's not a partner for peace either. So I think the PA sort of institutionally may be better set up to do that one day, maybe when Abbas is not in the picture. But they're problematic as well. And you also see widespread corruption within the Palestinian Authority. That's, taking aid money away from the people and lining the pockets of those in charge. They haven't had elections in, I think, almost 20 years or more than 20 years. They're also not good. It's bad.
And the UN, it seems to me, is complicit in this, because the refugee camps on the other side of in Bethlehem, 2 kilometers from the Church of the Nativity. I remember visiting a refugee camp, and the "We will return" is on the wall, and refugee status is handed down generation to generation, perpetuating this idea that one day they'll return.
Yeah, that's what my column was about, actually, in the Post and the Citizen this week. By upsetting the apple cart, I think we really do need to deal with UNRWA, the United Nations Refugee. What is it? UNRWA.
UNRWA.
Relief Works Association. It's not the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. No. There was a population of about 700,000, say, Palestinians that were displaced during the War of Independence in 1948. There were also 700,000 Jews who were driven out of Arab countries around the same time, who found refuge in Israel. That population has now swollen to about 6 million people. We tended to sort of shuffle the right of return. Okay, well, let's do some peace negotiations. We'll deal with the right of return later. I'm sorry. You have now 4 generations of young Palestinians who have grown up in an institutional environment. The entire infrastructure was created and is maintained by the United Nations that gives them to believe that their predicament is temporary. That one day they'll be marching down the streets of a Judenrein Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
This is what we've created. This is the international community. I'm sorry. And, I think this is, what I was talking about earlier. It's terrible, the predicament that Palestinians have put in. Hundreds and probably thousands and thousands of Palestinians are going to die now. And God knows how many more Israelis are going to die. And it's because we've all wanted stability. We'll fund UNRWA. We'll let Bibi, sort of triangulate between Abu Mazen and Ismail Haniyeh, and, we'll contain it there, right? And there is a real fear. I think what Sarah was saying earlier about the nature of Hamas, the big argument among the senior jihadis has been the argument, say, between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Do we fight the near enemy or the far enemy? Do we take territory, or do we just do global jihad? I think we have to recognize that in the event that the Israelis are successful and Hamas is smashed in Gaza, Hamas will become a global movement. Hamas will go from the sort of ISIS way of thinking to the Al-Qaeda way of thinking. And Jews everywhere will be imperiled. I think we have to face facts.
So just going back to the domestic situation in Israel and Palestine, or the West Bank, there are no gods and precious few heroes in this story. There seems to be a need for great leadership, and it's been entirely absent on all sides. Netanyahu, what do you think, Sarah? Is this finally the end of him?
He's finished.
I think so. I think the fact that this happened on his watch, he's done. I mean, it's like Golda Meir in '73, but 10 times worse. I think he'll be around as part of this war cabinet. I don't think anyone is looking to upset leadership at this critical time. But once this is over, he's toast. Yeah.
Terry, just looking at the bigger picture again, the US is massively overstretched fiscally. It's now supporting allies in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. Some people think that China, Russia and Iran are acting in concert, waiting for the right moment to overturn the international order. Do you think that's too conspiratorial, or is it possible?
They're not waiting, John.
Do you think we might see a third front? I don't think we're going to see Taiwan.
17 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Iran. I'm sorry, Terry, go on.
No, I just think this is the other thing. The penny, sooner or later, the penny's going to have to drop. That we've talked about this, John, and I sympathize with your hopes, as I think I probably shared, for a sort of a global free trade regime, all that sort of thing back in the day. You can't do free trade with a police state, and the international order has been assaulted, is being assaulted constantly. There is a kind of an axis that is primarily Tehran, Moscow, Beijing. Sooner or later, people are going to have to, well, the old days are gone.
But do you think it's possible we might see a third front where China does something extremely provocative in the South China Sea, for example?
Taiwan, yeah, sure. Well, for instance, I don't think Putin would have been so reckless as to attempt a war of conquest in Ukraine had he not been informed by the American capitulation in Afghanistan. The Taliban didn't beat the Americans. They didn't win that war. Trump and Biden decided to surrender to Pakistan. That's what happened there. And, this is the difficulty. I complain about UNRWA. But, when Trump a couple of years ago just sort of pulled all the funding from UNRWA, okay, I'm going, right, I'm leaving, it was a stunt. The difficulty is in situations like that is you pull out, the vacuum gets filled right away. So you've got China and Russia and Tehran that between them control, I don't know, what would you think, Sarah? I'm going to say 2/3 of all the leading United Nations agencies now. Way to go.
Seems right to me.
Congratulations, hippies. This is what you wanted, right? Multipolarity. So yeah, this is what happens.
What do you think, Sarah? Putin was in Beijing this week. That doesn't seem coincidental.
No, I agree. There is sort of this axis forming, and you also have to look at these conflicts like who benefits, right? For one thing, Hamas is, by all intents and purposes, an Iranian proxy. They're 70% funded by the IRGC, is the last statistic I heard. They get support from Qatar and Turkey. Their leader lives in Qatar, right? This is a proxy war. And so Iran's benefiting from this. Russia's certainly benefiting because it's distracting from the war in Ukraine. China's benefiting because it's distracting from the Uyghur genocide. So you have to sort of look at this, a bit more broadly, and I think Terry hit the nail right on the head.
So just to round things up, one of the most interesting things I read this week was in The Economist. It was an interview with Ehud Barak, who was the former Prime Minister of Israel, former Defence Minister, former Commander of the Israeli Defence Force. A man who clearly knows a thing or two about fighting in Gaza. He pointed out that Hamas is not an existential threat to Israel and that the Israelis will win, and he put a timeline on that, 2 to 6 weeks. He then suggested a kind of roadmap for how things might play out, which was an Arab peacekeeping force to secure the Gaza Strip and then the re-establishment of the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. Each of you in turn, Terry, first of all, is that really the best we could hope for?
That would be great. That would be great. I think the main thing that I tend to observe is that there's a couple of things that they happen at the same time in the region and also in the West, is that we've kind of expected the Israelis to take care of this problem. I don't know why Gaza is an Israeli. Why is Gaza an Israeli problem? This isn't about territory. And so we've always sort of expected the Israelis to take care of the problems we got there, and a lot of Americans like to see Israel as a kind of an outpost. So we'll let the Israelis take care of it. And similarly, the whole cultural milieu in which Hamas, the PFLP, Fatah thrives, I should say, and the Khomeinists as well, they thrive in Europe and North America. We always leave it to the Jews to take care of this. They seem to be some Nazis over there. We'll let the Jews worry about it. And I think we all have to sort of bear some of the responsibility, bear some of the burden for what we're seeing now. And we can complain and whine and talk about war crimes to our heart's content. Israel will do what Israel needs to do to survive. And if by any means Egypt, the Saudis, and others could be persuaded to do some heavy lifting of their own in Gaza, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Yeah, Sarah, just to round off on that point that Terry made, I think it is a fair point that we've seen supporters of a free Palestine or an independent Palestine on the streets of Canada, on the streets of London today in Washington. We haven't seen much of the other side. We saw there was a big rally in North York last week, I think. But again, as to Terry's point, we're leaving it to the Jewish population. To me, anybody who believes in democracy and freedom and the rule of law should be out in the streets outraged that people are celebrating this Hamas assault. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's also essential because if you look at the population numbers even, Jews, we're a tiny, tiny group. We can't pull up in those kinds of numbers. And beyond that, I think many of us haven't really wanted to. Most of my family did go to the rally in North York, but for the most part, I haven't written op-eds on this. I haven't been super active because we're all in mourning as well. You have to remember, October 7th was the day that the most amount of Jews were killed in a single day since the Holocaust. We were all in tears for a week straight, at least. It's really a period of grief. So to have us to have to also be on the defensive and be sort of on the streets and advocating and fighting back against this ridiculous amounts of hate and celebration in the wake of these deaths. It's too much for us, and it's just too much for me.
Yeah. Well, hopefully there is more solidarity shown in the weeks ahead than there has been in the weeks behind us. So, thank you very much for both of you for coming on. I think that was an excellent discussion. Thank you.
Great talking to you guys.
Thanks.